Every case leaves a trace, a name, a date, a question that was never answered. This is Silent Shadows. On the morning of October 12, 1944, household staff entered an apartment at El Palacio, an elegant Spanish-style building in West Hollywood. Inside, they found 20-year-old Georgette Bauerdorf dead in her bathtub. At first glance, the scene offered no simple explanation. Her home had not been stripped of valuables, and there was no obvious reason for anyone to target her. But one small detail waited outside. The entrance light had been loosened. Leaving her doorway in darkness, that darkened doorway would become one of the case's most haunting clues. It suggested forethought. Someone may have wanted to approach the apartment without being seen, or wait near the entrance without attracting attention. Then again, investigators had to consider whether it was connected at all. A loose bulb can be deliberate, accidental, or entirely unrelated, and in this case, nearly every important detail seemed to open several possibilities without firmly proving any one of them. Georgette was the daughter of a wealthy oil executive. She came from privilege, but she was also living with a degree of independence that was unusual enough to attract notice. Los Angeles newspapers would emphasize her family, her money, and her Hollywood surroundings, yet wealth did not explain what happened. If anything, it deepened the mystery because jewelry, silver, and cash remained inside the apartment. Whatever the killer wanted, ordinary theft did not appear to be the central motive. To understand her final night, you have to picture Los Angeles during the Second World War. The city was crowded with military personnel, defense workers, entertainers, and new arrivals. Streets that looked glamorous from a distance could feel anonymous after dark. People met quickly and separated just as quickly. Wartime movement created a constant stream of unfamiliar faces, and that made tracing a stranger far more difficult than it might seem today. Georgette spent the evening of October 11th volunteering as a junior hostess at the Hollywood Canteen. The canteen offered servicemen food, dancing, music, and a few hours of relief before they returned to duty or continued their journeys. Film stars sometimes appeared there, but much of the work was done by volunteers. Junior hostesses danced with servicemen, spoke with them, and helped create a welcoming atmosphere. Georgette was one of the young women filling that role. Now that setting matters, but it should not be treated as an explanation by itself. The canteen brought Georgette into contact with many men, most of whom were simply service members passing through. Still, investigators naturally looked at the people she might have encountered there. Had someone become fixated on her? Had a casual conversation been misread as an invitation? Or did her killer have no connection to the canteen at all? Those questions would shadow the investigation. After finishing her volunteer shift, Georgette returned toward El Palacio. The exact sequence of her final movements has never been established with complete certainty. There was no modern surveillance footage, no mobile telephone record, and no electronic trail placing every person at a precise location. Detectives had to rely on memories, sightings, physical evidence, and statements gathered after the crime became public. Each passing hour made those memories less certain and gave rumor more room to grow. At some point during the night or early morning, someone entered her apartment. Investigators found no clear sign that valuables had been gathered for removal. Nothing about the scene pointed to a burglary interrupted halfway through. Instead, the evidence indicated a personal and violent attack. The autopsy established that Georgette had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her death was not an accident in the bath, and it was not a voluntary disappearance followed by misadventure. It was murder. The bathroom setting complicated the scene. A bathtub can distort first impressions, particularly when water is present, and it can destroy or dilute evidence. In the 1940s, forensic investigators did not have genetic profiling, computerized databases, or many of the laboratory techniques now considered routine. They could document injuries, examine fibers, compare fingerprints, and study biological evidence in limited ways. But they could not extract the kind of identifying information that might solve the same case today. So let's back up to the apartment entrance. The automatic light outside Georgette's door had been partially unscrewed. It was not simply burned out. Someone had apparently turned the bulb enough to interrupt the electrical connection, darkening the immediate area. If the killer did that, it suggests the person anticipated arriving or leaving unseen. It might also indicate familiarity with the building, because someone had to notice the light, understand how it worked, and decide that darkness was useful. But the light does not tell us whether the attacker waited outside, slipped in behind Georgette, or entered earlier and remained inside. Nor does it establish whether she knew the person. A familiar visitor might have been admitted willingly. A stranger could have used deception. Someone might even have entered through an unsecured door. The darkened bulb frames the doorway as important, but it does not reveal what happened on either side of it. Then there was the missing car. The Oldsmobile belonging to Georgette's sister was gone from the apartment building. That immediately raised the possibility that the killer had used it to escape. The vehicle was eventually recovered roughly 10 miles away. It appeared to have been abandoned after running out of fuel. That detail feels almost cinematic, but in practical terms it created another uncertain trail. Whoever left the car could have continued on foot, caught a ride, or disappeared into wartime traffic. The abandoned Oldsmobile also sharpened the contrast with the untouched valuables. Jewelry, silver, and cash were still inside Georgette's residence. If the attacker took the car, it may have been for transportation rather than profit. Perhaps the vehicle offered a quick way to create distance from the crime scene. Perhaps it was taken to confuse investigators. Or perhaps the person who drove it had arrived without reliable transportation and used the first available means of escape. Of course, a missing car can generate witnesses. Detectives could ask who saw it, where it traveled, and whether anyone noticed the driver. But Los Angeles was already a car-centered city, and an Oldsmobile on the road would not necessarily draw attention. Once the tank was empty and the driver walked away, the useful trail may have ended within minutes. Without a dependable description, the abandoned vehicle was both a major clue and a dead end. Household staff discovering the body also meant the apartment had been entered by more than one person before every detail could be interpreted by investigators. That was common in an era before carefully standardized crime scene control. People might move through rooms, touch doors, or react instinctively before realizing a murder had occurred. None of that implies wrongdoing by the staff. It simply means the original scene could never be preserved with the precision expected in a modern homicide investigation. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department began working through Georgette's personal life and recent contacts. Detectives needed to separate ordinary acquaintances from genuine suspects. Her role at the canteen widened the field dramatically. A man who had danced with her might remember the encounter as meaningless, while another might exaggerate it after seeing her photograph in the newspaper. Investigators faced the difficult task of deciding which stories reflected real contact and which existed only because the case had become famous. Newspaper coverage added pressure. Georgette was young, wealthy, and connected to a glamorous part of Los Angeles. She had spent her last evening at a celebrated wartime institution. Those facts made the case irresistible to the press, but publicity can damage an investigation as easily as it can help one. Once specific details become public, detectives lose the ability to test whether a suspect knows something only the killer should know. Publicity also invites confession. The sheriff's department received numerous claims from people saying they were responsible or knew who was. False confessions may come from attention seekers, people experiencing mental illness, individuals trying to protect someone else, or prisoners hoping to manipulate their circumstances. Each statement still has to be checked. Where was the person that night? Could they describe the apartment? Did they know unreleased evidence? In Georgette's case, the confessions did not produce a charge, and that is an important distinction. A confession is not automatically proof. If the speaker repeats information printed in newspapers, offers details contradicted by the autopsy, or cannot physically be placed in California, investigators have reason to reject the claim. Yet checking those stories takes time and manpower. Every false lead can pull detectives away from quieter evidence, while the actual offender has more time to leave the area, change appearance, or blend into the enormous movement of wartime personnel. The wartime context created another practical obstacle. Servicemen regularly transferred between bases, embarked overseas, or returned from deployments. Civilian workers moved in search of defense jobs. A person seen in Hollywood one evening might be hundreds of miles away shortly afterward, without that movement appearing suspicious. Records existed, of course, but they were scattered across military offices, employers, hotels, and transportation systems. There was no single database detectives could search with a few keystrokes. Investigators also had to examine the possibility that Georgette knew her attacker. The absence of a ransacked home could support that idea, but it does not prove it. Many violent offenders ignore valuable property because theft was never their purpose. A stranger could have followed her from the canteen or noticed her elsewhere. Someone familiar with her routine could have known when she would return. The scene allowed for all of those possibilities, which is precisely why the case resisted a clean theory. Now here's where the darkened light becomes especially unsettling. If someone loosened it before Georgette came home, the act could indicate planning and surveillance. The attacker may have known which apartment was hers and expected her at a certain time. If it was loosened afterward, the purpose might have been to conceal the killer's departure. Either version suggests a calm decision made around an act of extreme violence. Yet without a witness, investigators could not determine when the bulb was touched. There's also a temptation in an unsolved case to turn every unexplained object into a coded message. Good investigation requires restraint. The loose bulb might be central, but it cannot identify a hand. The empty fuel tank might reveal an improvised escape, but it cannot establish where the driver went next. Untouched money might rule against robbery, but it cannot reveal motive by itself. Evidence narrows possibilities only when separate facts begin reinforcing one another. In Georgette's case, those facts never formed a complete chain. Detectives had a young woman last known to have volunteered at the Hollywood Canteen, a fatal attack in her apartment, a deliberately darkened entrance, and a car abandoned miles away. They had people to interview and confessions to test. What they did not have was a reliable witness placing a particular person inside the apartment, physical evidence conclusively identifying an attacker, or a confession supported by private knowledge. The investigation continued through leads involving strangers, acquaintances, and men who claimed some connection to Georgette. Some may have attracted suspicion because their behavior seemed odd. Others came under scrutiny because a witness remembered a conversation or an encounter. But suspicion is not the same as evidence strong enough for court. No matter how compelling a theory sounds afterward, prosecutors need proof that can survive challenge. In this case, no suspect was charged with Georgette's murder. As the years passed, the case became harder to solve. Witnesses died or forgot details. Records were lost, discarded, or separated from their original context. Physical evidence collected under older standards might not have been preserved in a condition suitable for later testing. Even when new forensic methods emerge, they can only help if usable material still exists and if investigators can establish where it came from. Time does not merely cool a case, it changes what can still be proven. The Hollywood Canteen eventually became part of wartime history, remembered through photographs and stories of famous performers dancing with young servicemen. Georgette's connection to it remained frozen on her last night. That association can make her seem like a character in a Hollywood mystery, but she was not. She was a 20-year-old woman doing volunteer work, returning to her residence and expecting an ordinary tomorrow. The glamour surrounding the setting should never obscure the reality of what was taken from her. Her family's wealth also shaped how the public viewed the crime. It generated headlines and encouraged theories about secret romances, jealous admirers, or hidden motives. But there is no need to invent drama. The verified facts are disturbing enough. Georgette was attacked in her own home. Her killer left behind property that could have been stolen, apparently used her sister's car to escape, and vanished without being held legally accountable. Could the answer have been in the canteen's crowded rooms, with someone Georgette met only briefly? Could it have been a person who watched El Palacio and learned her routine? Or was it someone she recognized and trusted enough to let inside? Those remain possibilities, not conclusions. The surviving evidence does not allow us to choose responsibly between them. And that uncertainty is one reason the case has endured in public memory for so long. What remains most vivid is the sequence of deliberate acts: a bulb loosened, an entrance darkened, a young woman overpowered, and a car driven until its fuel was gone. Somewhere within that sequence was a person whose identity investigators could never establish. The false confessions, public theories, and promising leads all failed to bridge the gap between suspicion and proof. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department never secured the evidence needed to charge anyone. Georgette Bauerdorf's murder remains officially unsolved. There is no courtroom verdict to provide closure, and no confirmed account explaining how the killer reached her door or escaped afterward. What remains is a carefully documented absence, untouched valuables, an abandoned Oldsmobile, and a doorway placed in darkness just before or after a violent crime. More than anything, the case asks us to remember Georgette not as a mystery symbol, but as the young woman at the center of an unanswered loss. If this case stayed with you, there are others waiting. Subscribe to Silent Shadows and walk with us into the next one.